Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Kumsty-Fowler and thank you for joining me again as part of this leadership development series. We're going to start a two-part conversation today about changing our questions to change our leadership. And it's two parts because questions are so influential, and we spent a lot of time working on this with the leadership development cohort. So let's just take a moment to pause and say, why are questions so influential? Any thoughts popping up? Well, let's think about this morning when you woke up. How did questions inform the first hour of your day today? And then, I just hold that because I'm going to actually ask you to press pause for a moment and have this discussion for a couple of minutes. But so the first question is, as you opened your eyes this morning, how did questions inform the first hour of your day and how that went? And then secondly, how can another person's question influence you positively or negatively within minutes of arriving at work? So why don't you press pause, discuss this for a couple of minutes, and then come back. I'm sure that you have seen this quote from Albert Einstein. I'm not going to read it, but essentially the gist of it is, if I had an hour to solve a problem that my life depended on, I would be spending 55 minutes getting the proper question or the right question. And I think what we need to take away from this is that it's the questions that we ask that lead us towards discovery and towards solution finding. And we can ask lots of questions, but if we're asking the wrong question, then we're never going to get the answer that we need to learn from. So our challenge then is, how as leaders do we learn to ask questions that firstly transform our understanding of ourselves, of others, and of situations that we're facing? How do we ask the kind of question that gives us useful, actionable insight so it's something that I can work with, it's not something that I have no control over? And then how do we use questions so that we support the development of a positive culture at OHCQ, and not just at OHCQ, within our families or the work we do with clients? And how do we learn to ask questions in such a way that we anchor our leadership in a sense of learning and curiosity? So before we move on to the how to ask good questions, I need to ask you just for a moment to suspend your disbelief. Because what I'm going to tell you is the most important attribute that we need to develop in order to ask good questions may make no sense for many of you, or it sometimes lands as a little touchy-feely and new-agey. So I'm just warning you before I advance the slide to show you what is the most important attribute that we need to have in our questioning. And that would be, drumroll, humility. If we do not have humility, genuine humility, we cannot ask good questions. Humility is what creates that space for discovery. And do you remember early on I said that when one of the signs that really good listening is in place is that we see silence. And silence is space. And in that space, we are able to pause and reflect and ask good questions. And so our goal as leaders is to develop humble and non-judgmental curiosity, not just for the other people that we lead, but for ourselves. Because as we'll discover on the way through this time together today, sometimes we are the most judgmental with ourselves. This is a quote that I use many, many times. Now, I think that it originated with Daniel Boorstin, who is the Librarian of Congress, but it's also been attributed to Stephen Hawking subsequently. And whoever owns it, I don't really mind. It's a great quote. The greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. And we have all had the unfortunate experience of working with people who know everything. And those of us who've had the privilege of parenting teenagers know exactly what this feels like, right? So if I think that I know, why would I bother to ask questions? Now, this can also show up in a slightly subtler form in an organization where people will say, well, look, what's going on here is pretty obvious to me. I mean, I've been here for a long time. I've seen this play out. It's nothing new. So then why should I waste time that I don't have asking questions? And this is a real challenge when we are working in programs for many years or even just for many months, because the reality of what that program was or that program's context and truth and reality was maybe true 2 years ago, but things change so rapidly in our world that there may have been subtle transitions and subtle changes that have the ability to impact what's going on. And so we have to discipline ourselves to stay in a place of humble and non-judgmental curiosity. So we've already learned that an essential leadership requirement is deep listening, both to ourselves and to others. And I want to get back to that because when we are not fully attentive and we're not displaying humble and non-judgmental curiosity in our interactions, people know. Remember we told you that when you were the speaker and the listener wasn't listening, you knew it, right? You knew in your gut that people were not listening to you. And so when you know you're not being heard and you're not being understood, you either get upregulated and upset, or you just disengage and detach and stop wanting to share insight. And so this is something that leaders need to recognize, that whether it's consciously or subconsciously, people actually pick up on whether or not you're listening from a place of curiosity. And I've added a resource to this slide. This is sort of the 8 habits of curious people, and it really talks about if we look at really superbly curious and present leaders as they listen to people, what do we see? And it's a quick and easy read for you. I recommend it. So now I'm going to ask you to spend some time together as a group. And you're going to start by reflecting individually just for a moment. And whether you decide to reflect on both these questions or whether you decide to do the first question and discuss it and then the second question, that is completely up to you and the facilitator. But essentially what I want you to think about are these 2 things. How do people ask you questions? And as they ask you questions in a certain way, how do you feel? Then, how do you answer or respond based on the way they ask you these questions? And also, what are you willing to share with them based on how they're asking you questions? And then, the truth we have to own is, how do I ask other people questions? And if I think about that honestly, what response do I notice in other people when I ask questions a certain way? And what information do I get from them based on how I ask the questions? All right? I'll trust you to know how long you're going to spend on this. And when you're finished with your conversation, I'll be here. Just press play. So then, how can changing our questions change our personal and professional results? What were some of the things that we took away from that discussion? So I'm not going to, talk too much about this because you just had this conversation, but some of the things that come up a lot is the fact that when people feel that someone who is asking them questions is genuinely asking to learn as opposed to proving what they believe, when the person is really listening, when the person is really present, when I feel that that question doesn't have an agenda. So they're not asking me this agenda. You don't have this agenda and you're trying to prove something by asking me this question. I don't feel like you're asking a question to trap me or trick me into saying something. You're not asking a question to judge me. I'm more likely to be open and to share my ideas with you. Similarly, when I feel that there's some hidden agenda behind this question, or the fact that you're asking a question but you really don't want to know, then I'm going to begin to be protective and defensive and wary of what it is that I share with you. There are many, many leadership resources that focus on the art of the question. The two that we use the most in these modules are those Change Your Questions, Change Your Life by Dr. Marilee Adams, and then the Sternin and Pasquale book, The Power of Positive Deviance. But there are many. Edgar Schein's Humble Inquiry is a book that I personally love. But there are numerous resources. So the discussion of how we ask questions is actually not unique to any one writer. There are shared themes in these books. The first is the importance of humble curiosity, asking questions to learn versus to judge. That wording may be different. In some, Dr. Adams is the one who talks a lot about learner and judger. But this idea that people know that I really want to learn something is shared in all of these books. The idea that questions provide the breakthrough to discovery is an important theme in leadership. The ability to ask assets-based or strengths-based questions. So I'm not just asking about what's missing or what's wrong. The ability to keep a focus on the positive as I ask questions, that's different than the strengths. Because I may actually be asking questions about things that are challenges and that are problems. However, the focus of this is transformation or possibility of making it better. Similarly, questioning without listening is useless. And then finally, the idea of using questions as part of our reflection. So learning to ask ourselves questions about what's going on and how we're responding and how we're leading. The leadership development cohort had a required textbook, and this was, in fact, Dr. Marilee Adams' book, Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. And some of you saw them present Dr. Adams' trust map at the open house. Now, I want to say that Dr. Adams' work is, in fact, copyrighted, so everybody had the book, and so they had the tools in the book, and we taught that. So we just ask you to be sensitive about sharing it beyond the scope of your team. I've also provided a link to a YouTube video of Dr. Adams discussing the choice map, and I've provided a link to the Inquiry Institute where you'll find other resources. But for the time being, let's just look at how Dr. Adams says that changing the questions we ask will change our results. So we can improve our questions simply to get information or create understanding and learning. We can also use questions very intentionally to improve and sustain relationships, because the art of questioning, the humble, curious questioning and listening, is a way of building that trusting relationship that is foundational to the work we do. We can do it to clarify, to confirm, to question assumptions, to make sure that we haven't missed something. Questions, as I will discuss in another module, the one on evaluative thinking, are really foundational to creativity and innovation. Because if I think that I know, why would I consider an alternative? And so sometimes the ability to just brainstorm and think about, well, how do we move beyond where we are now is really important. And that, of course, is all question dependent. We use questions to resolve and to prevent conflict. We use it to develop collaboration. We use questions extensively as we set our goals and create action plans. And of course, questions are at the heart of any kind of exploration or discovery. So then, how do we begin to improve our questions? Well, the first piece in improving anything is to notice it. So I can't change a bad habit if I don't notice it, and I can't do more of my good habits if I don't notice that I'm doing them. So we learn to notice questions, not cognitively. We learn to notice questions by experiencing our responses to questions, and that's a visceral response. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and notice how you feel as you hear the questions that I'm going to ask you. Now, let me set this up before you sit there with your eyes closed for a minute. Once I've read, I'm not going to read the questions to you, I'm going to ask you these questions, but I'd like you to have your eyes shut so you don't see me. I want you to have a group reflection for a few minutes where I want you to share single words that you would associate with these questions. So as you hear me ask you these questions, I don't want you to answer them or explain anything. I just want you to share those single words that came up as you hear these questions. All right, are you ready to close your eyes? Let's see what we can do. So what's wrong with you? Why can't you get to work on time? Now, weren't we clear about what it was that we needed to do? So what's the problem with these people? Like, why can't they actually do what it is we ask them to do? Why can't you comply with these regulations? Don't you understand that if you don't comply with these regulations, your patients are going to get hurt? Mm-hmm. So what's wrong? Like, why can I just not seem to explain myself properly? Why can I not communicate the way I need to communicate? Like, why can I just not get it together on time? Why can't I get my work done? What's wrong with this situation? Like, whose fault is this situation? Right? I think that's enough of that. Why don't you pause the video and react? Okay. Wasn't a good feeling, was it? Right? Feel exhausted, feels horrible. I'm going to come back to that though. I'm not going to say much more till we get past this exercise. Now, you're going to do the same thing. So I'm going to ask you a set of questions, and then you're going to discuss what was your response. What did you feel when I ask you these questions? And I want you to use single words to describe that. Okay? How do I really feel about this? What do I want? How could I grow in this situation? What is it that we could do together that we're not doing by ourselves right now? What's the possibility? How could our partners help us with this? What do they think about that? What are the possibilities if we change the way we've been doing business? How can I help you get your work done? I know you've been struggling to get to work on time, but is there anything that I can do to help support you in achieving that? How are you feeling? What do you enjoy to do the most? What about the job you do gives you the greatest satisfaction? Could we be missing something here? Could we maybe pause and ask some other questions? I'm going to ask you to press pause and have a conversation about that. So what those two sets of questions represented were, firstly, a set of judger questions. And then the second set of questions was what we would call a set of learner questions. So the judger questions are really not being asked to learn anything. They're being asked to judging ourselves, like, why can't I get this done? Or why can't you get this done? Who's at fault? It's a very much us, them, or me, you conflict type of question. The mood, what about the mood in these questions? How was your mood when you heard these questions, right? Not great. The mindset, closed, narrow. What did these questions do to our willingness to relate to each other? Did you feel kind of like you just wanted to pour out your heart and soul to me when I asked you those horrible questions? Did you get defensive? Yeah, so these are very negative questions, but the way that I really like to summarize these, and this is very important for us because we just don't have any time and we're all tired anyway, is that these questions, without exception, are energy drainers. They drop the level of energy in the room. Well, I mean, you may feel upregulated, like I'm getting upset, but that's not positive energy. So if we're looking at the positive energy in a room, judger questions just drop it, they take it down. Now, the learner questions are different, right? So when I ask a learner question, or when you hear a learner question, it's very different. It's like, the mindset is open, it's more curious, and really the question is building relationships. So remember that question, like, I know you're struggling to get to work on time, but like, how can I support you in this? It's saying I need you to be at work on time, but that's very different than saying, well, why can't you get yourself to work on time? What I'm doing with a learner question is like, I understand this is challenging. Like, how can we work together, and how can I help support you in being successful here? So what we learn about learner questions is that in the presence of learner questions, the positive energy and the energy available to solution find and to collaborate goes up. Now, you have seen this map, and this is the choice map that Dr. Adams has in the book that was a required reading. And I'm not going to read these questions to you. You can read them. But what I'm going to do is to walk you through the process of looking at the map, and then I'm going to have you spend some time on it, with your facilitator. But essentially what you see is that we have the person on the starting place. And he is going to go on a journey. Now, depending on what kind of questions he asks himself, he's going to go one or the other way. So clearly the goal is that we would ask ourselves all the learner questions that we were hearing before, like, what's a possibility? What do I need to know? What do I need to think? How could we think about this? Because as I ask learner questions, it draws me into a place where I continue to learn and grow, and I continue my learning, and ultimately I have the potential to discover solutions and solve problems. There's only one way that the judger path ends, and that is in what you'll have heard your colleagues mentioning it jokingly, is it ends in the judger pit. If I continue to ask these negative questions that are about what's missing and what's wrong and whose fault it is and who I can blame and why I'm not good enough and why I can't fix things, because those questions are not actually asking anything that's useful in generating insight, I'm just going to go down that path of negativity till I get stuck in this pit. Now, there's an option, and we'll come back to that in a little while. But at any point, as I find myself on the judger path, like I find myself saying, Carolyn, why can't you get all this work done? Like, why was it you got to the end of the day and you still had those 2 things you hadn't finished? That's not going to end well. But at some point, if I say, you know what, you got 18 of the 20 things done. Is that good enough? Like, how does it make me feel? What's important? What do I want? Do I want to do it well, or do I want to do everything badly? That's a very different kind of question. And at any point that I change my question, I notice that I'm in the judger, and I change my question and ask a learner question, that allows me to access that switching lane. And at any point, I can switch back up into a place that I'm in learner. The question, of course, is how we do that. So one of the things, and I'm not really advocating that you all put elastic bands on your wrist and snap it. However, let me tell you that that's what the leadership development cohort did. They started wearing elastic bands around their wrists, and they would notice, like if they noticed themselves in judger, they'd be like, oh, there I'm in judger. However, this is a technique you can use to notice how many times we go into judger. But I have a question for you, though. Based on what we know about how judgmental we are about ourselves, is there a potential problem when I get better at noticing when I'm in judger? Right? So if I keep noticing that I'm in judger, and I keep saying, oh, there you are in judger again. Like, why can't you stay in learner? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, so-and-so gets it right and so-and-so gets it right, but like you just keep getting in judger. What's the problem with that? Well, if I judge my judger, I'm just going to upregulate myself even more. If I'm judging my judger, there's no way I can get out of it. So part of what we need to do here is to notice when we go into judger, but to notice that with compassion and curiosity. So the way, and I tell you, as much as I teach this and I've practiced this, I go to judger. But when I find myself going to judger, I'll pause and I'll be like, what's this about? Like, why did you go to judger? That's interesting. Like, are you tired? Or, like, did somebody's question land wrong for you and therefore you're reacting? And so what we're aiming for is the ability to notice when we go to judge it, but to say, now that's interesting. I just went down the judger path. What can I learn about what just happened here so that I can prevent that happening again? And one of the things that we'll recommend to you is that you find yourself a buddy or a partner. I have a partner here at the hospital, and we regularly practice this, that, we come together and we think about the times where we've had a really hard time staying in learner and not being judgmental and not being negative. And her job is not to tell me what's wrong with me. Her job is just to ask me questions until I figure out what is it about this situation that puts me at risk for going down that judger path. And even when you're in the judge, I've had so many colleagues say, "Oh, I was in the judger pit. I was stuck there." And then my friend said, "All right, so why are you in the pit? Like, what's going on here?" So I'm going to encourage you to practice this with partners. The single most important part of this choice map is the switching lane. Learning to notice and switch is the art of this work. Noticing with curiosity and compassion and learning how to switch is where we need to be. So I'm not going to cram this content into this section because Dr. Adams offers many, many questions as possible switching questions. What we do is we think about them and we'll practice them and we'll try them. And what we know is that for some people, certain questions work better than others. So, if I'm busy fighting with my child, I might say, is this the parent that I want to be? Is this how I want to be in this moment? Right? Is this how I want this conversation to end? And so these are switching questions. For me personally, one that is very helpful is, what is this really about? So if somebody storms in and they're angry and they're upset, instead of getting defensive, I might why are they upset? What is this really about? Let me just pause and try and understand that. So when we get together next time, we are going to be having a conversation about this. And so what I'm going to ask you to do before we do part 2, and I would really suggest that you don't go straight to part 2, is spend some time noticing the learner and the judger questions. You'll be able to ask some different questions even without us looking at a lot of them. And then when you're ready, we'll get together for part 2. We'll talk about how we switch from judger to learner. We'll talk a little bit more about how we practice switching questions in the moment. We're also going to be talking about how we look at the assets questions. And then we're going to learn a technique, which is to pause and use the ABCD switching technique, which is to become aware that I'm doing it, to breathe, to be curious about what's going on, and to decide to approach it differently. Until then, I wish you luck with your practice, and I'll see you again soon.